Okay, so in our first video, we talked about sort of the background of some of the Islamic gunpowder empires and sort of what some of their beginning similarities were. And then we expanded ourselves into the Ottoman Empire, which existed in this little green spot, not little green spot, large green spot here in the western side of the map, going into, the Middle East, into North Africa, and into the Balkans. And we sort of looked at, how they expanded and sort of what life was like for, people who were in kind of the religious minority. And then we talked a little bit about the politics. So now we're going to shift to the middle group here, the Safavid Empire, and then we'll move over to the Mughals as we expand into, this video. So the Safavid Empire is essentially, as we said in the first one, predominantly territory that would be kind of Afghanistan and Iran, and then also into some of these territories up here of, what would be the Caucasus Mountains. And so unlike the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire, which would be more connected to what we consider to be Sunni Islam, and Sunni Islam being the largest form of Islam globally, the Safavids initially trace their ancestry through a famous Sufi mystic, and something al-Din, and they mention, and sort of draw power from them. And also, being a Turkic group too, they kind of lived in the area. So, again, being a nomadic warriors fit in very, very well with that, but they draw inspiration and connection to that Sufi mystic. And then over time, to get more of a following and a more of a strong base because of the location of where they are, tie themselves into the Shia or Shiite version of Islam and ancestry. So saying that they are sort of the connection to the remnants of the caliph known as Ali, who was Muhammad's nephew. And remember that when we talked about, the differences between Islam in the beginning of the year, we looked at the fact that you have, the Sunni Muslims who, there's the big difference anyway at the beginning is who should be Muhammad's successor. And Muhammad didn't lay that out before he died. So some people said it should be, selected leaders, we should, choose based on, knowledge and quality and skills. And then you have the Shia or Shiites who say, well, we think it should be in the family lineage. And even though Muhammad didn't have a son, they said, well, let's go to his nephew. And that would be Ali. And then there was infighting in the couple hundred years after that about, who should follow. So essentially, the Safavids claim the legacy and the lineage, shifting away from the Sufi mystics to the Shiite and, sort of the lineage of Ali being sort of that last part of the line or of that lineage piece, which makes them distinct because, again, as we were saying, the Sunnis are led by, or the Sunnis are leaders in the Ottoman Empire, but also the Mughal Empire down here in India. So that is a big shift within kind of the religious context of the Safavids. All right, and so once they have control of this territory and begin to expand, to sort of draw on more of their power and authority, they make more claims in saying that they are, in fact, the true descendants and that they are the true heirs of Islam. All right, so with the Ottomans saying that you're sort of the chief defenders of the faith based on having Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina, the Safavids say that, they're the real successors to Muhammad and, Ali. And so they force most of the Sunnis inside of their territory to convert. And so hence why when you look at a map today of, where are Sunni and Shia Muslims located, most of the Shias are located in Iran and parts of Iraq, or this part of Iraq, kind of on the eastern side, which helps to sort of explain that because this is also where they've been historically based. But now you also have the forced conversions over to them in fear of, if you don't, you might be exiled, you might be persecuted within that. Now, there's also, some Jewish people and some Christians that also exist within the Safavid Empire that, do live there. And then there are merchants that obviously are given free passes to trade, and that way more wealth, again, comes into the Safavid Empire. But we'll talk about that in a minute or so. So, while they also expand through the use of gunfire and gunpowder and cannons, especially, again, over nomadic groups and cavalry and things like that, they themselves don't necessarily have the numbers and the power to fight off, again, bigger rivals, predominantly the Ottoman Empire here. And so you can kind of see that, as well as they get weaker, fighting off incursions from, areas north of the Caspian Sea of this line, kind of where we'd see Bukhara and Khiva, so with Uzbeks and Tartars and Kazakhs having that struggle. So for them, the book mentions the Battle of Chaldiran, essentially saying, how cavalry is not important anymore because of gunpowder and cannons being more effective on the battlefield than horseback, archers, and swords, which had been essentially the whole strength of the Mongol and the Turkic nomads for hundreds of years throughout the territories and throughout this area, is now becoming obsolete, and that is very much shown during that battle where the Safavids lose to the Ottomans. Okay, and so that tension between the Sunni and the Shia has been kind of on and off throughout history, but now we begin to sort of understand more of that background as it now becomes a religious conflict dueling between empires. All right, so the Safavids themselves, they are willing to work with the Europeans, in particular, sometimes with the Portuguese, against the Ottomans to control that trade. Because for the Ottomans, again, here's the Persian Gulf, their trade, they have the ability to trade kind of through Bahrain and through what I can never think of the city down here. It's not Baghdad, Basra, that's it. Yeah, it's right there on the map. So they have an access to the Indian Ocean trade, as well as also the Red Sea on the other side of the Persian Gulf. Or the other side of the Persian Peninsula or the Arabian Peninsula, where you'd have Yemen and Oman. You can't exactly see that on this side, but if we go back to actually this map fits in pretty well with the so they have these connections here, but if the Portuguese are willing to trade and work with the Safavids, for those trading rights, and then also some access to maybe through the Caspian Sea and get trade that way over land, as well as to diminish the power, again, of the Ottomans. And so the Safavids are willing to work with them on that point. All right. So similarly, we're at the beginning of the Safavid Empire, also with with the Mughals and the Ottomans. The use of cavalry is kind of where their power begins back in the day, and then that power gets diluted again over time as gunpowder becomes more and more important. And sort of how you see internal conflict within the Ottomans. Because, again, the bureaucrats putting in too many taxes, mismanagement of funds, things of that, weaken the Safavids from inside. But at the same time, they are still willing to, again, promote trade in order to earn their wealth. So they are creating, Persian textiles, so think Persian rugs, Afghan, rugs, things of that nature. They protect merchants in their area as much as they can to, again, promote the Silk Road trade, as well as trade in the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf, again, to bring in more and more wealth. And unfortunately, I don't know about it, fortunately, but they are the first of these three gunpowder empires to sort of dissolve, before even around the, late 17 teens, early 1720s, is essentially when their empire sort of collapses within itself. Again, from issues with fighting with the Ottomans and then, invasions in the north, that the empire sort of just kind of falls away, and then you sort of get sort of a pre-early version of, Iran as a whole country from that. Okay. And then, so then with the Mughal Empire, again, being a very diverse location, the biggest difference with the Mughals is, with the Safavids and the Ottomans, their initial expansion is related to religion and pushing a certain form of Islam. The Mughals actually come to India because they can't actually conquer the territory that was to the north of them, i.e., up here, kind of where the Tartars are, and through Bukhara. They were not able, or at least their ancestors were not able to expand northward. They were trying to in several different invasions, and it was not successful. So instead, they headed down south and conquered much of, the Delhi Plain here in northern India, Pakistan, and parts of Afghanistan. So yeah, and that was kind of the reason why they came that way. So for them, it was about power and land grab and, wealth and goods, not related to religious expansion. The other big difference is that for the Mughal Empire, they are ruling a territory where they are the minority. So unlike the Safavids, who have that claim initially to the Sufis, and then they start persecuting the Sufis, as well as the Sunnis becoming Shia, and then you have the Ottomans, who are Sunni Muslims, and while they have Christians and Jews and other people living within their territories, they are still, for the most part, the majority in much of their, they are the religious majority. You might have pockets that are Christian or Jewish within both their territories, or both, the Safavids and the Ottomans, but the Mughals are literally the minority in much of the territory that they conquer. All right, because most of them are indeed Hindu. And again, there are other There are Shia Muslims, there are Jews, there are Christians, there are Buddhists. Again, think about the importance of the Indian Ocean trade. So again, when we looked at that stuff, it's really, really important. But the Mughals, because of that, for the most part, okay, the book does actually explain it depends on the ruler who is tolerant or intolerant of other religions. So for the most part, though, during the early parts of the Mughal Empire, they are fairly tolerant of other religions because they are the minority. In fact, the jizya tax is in many cases not even used on the Hindu population. That again will change over time as the final one that they mentioned in the book, Aurangzeb. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that name. I don't have it on me. But he essentially forces that jizya tax and starts destroying Hindu temples, trying to force conversions and pure forms of Islam. But again, prior to that, you actually had pretty good integration, pretty good tolerance of differences within that. So they would encourage marriage between important Muslim and Hindu families, but again, not forcing them to convert because they knew that cooperation was the key to their success for holding on to power inside of a territory when you are the minority. All right. So yeah, so some got rid of the jizya tax, while others are backed by previous Muslim scholars. Some would help build Hindu temples, others would destroy it and replace them with mosques, and that would lead to more religious tension during the time that also unfortunately led up to sort of when India became an independent country, led to India breaking up between India and Pakistan, and then also Bangladesh later on, when Bangladesh left Pakistan. So some of the attempts for gender, specifically within the Mughal Empire, was the more protection of women, specifically Hindu women. So this has a little bit more ties back into stuff we looked at way, way back in like chapter 14 or 15. Whenever we talked about, the Indian Ocean Basin way back in the day, when we talked about Hinduism and the caste system and the gender roles within that caste system as well. So protection for not only just Hindu women, but also some Muslim women too. So within Hinduism, there's the practice of widows not being able to remarry. They essentially had to isolate themselves. They tried to end child marriages. That wasn't successful, but again, there was an attempt to. So women are now allowed to remarry, try to prevent children from being married at such young ages. And then, the practice known as sati, which was women being killed, once their husbands died and were, burned on a pyre, that women would oftentimes be burned along with their husbands so that they wouldn't remarry, even though men could. It's gender inequities, things like that the Mughals had tried to again get rid of for better gender protections. And so for the Mughals, again, based on the fact that they are the closest, they are literally the ones on the Indian Ocean. Their money comes from taxing the Indian cotton and the spice markets that the Europeans are so important with or so endowed to. So when we looked at the Indian Ocean DBQ, we looked at Goa and Calicut as being massive locations for Muslims and Christian traders. You also have the Mughals up here as they were establishing their empire. That then the British and the Dutch and the Portuguese will then have to deal with them or later on. So you can kind of think about also the connection. So tying it back in with the Ottomans, when we looked at, why are, the Muslims in the Sultanate of Ak or Aceh, in, Indonesia, why do they want to form up with the Ottomans? Because they have this pincer move. Same thing with the Mughals, because the Mughals aren't willing to work with them. So in this territory, as, the British and, the other Europeans are setting up their trading posts, they're being allowed to do that because Mughals are making money off of them, as are the other Muslim and Hindu leaders within them. Okay, so that's kind of our tie-in. So the next video is going to kind of look at kind of more general things within all three of the empires in terms of trade, agriculture, gender roles, and things of that nature. So that is how we're going to wrap up chapter 27.